It was the spring of 1993, and the Chicago Bulls were in the middle of what everyone in basketball knew would be a defining season. 3 championships already, a dynasty in the making. And at the center of it all, Michael Jordan, the most scrutinized athlete on the planet, was carrying a weight that went far beyond basketball. The pressure of being Michael Jordan was something no one outside that locker room could fully understand. Every game was a referendum on greatness. Every loss was a national conversation. Every move he made on the court was analyzed, celebrated, or questioned by millions of people who felt they owned a piece of him simply because they watched him play. And while the world saw the highlights, the dunks, the game winners, the iconic moments frozen in time, very few people saw what was happening behind the curtain. It started with a story published in the spring of that year. A prominent sports writer, Richard Talbot, a man who had built his career on sharp, intellectually framed criticism, released a lengthy piece in one of the country's most respected sports publications. The article was titled, "The Myth of Jordan." It ran over 6,000 words, and within 48 hours, it had become the most talked-about piece of sports journalism in years. Talbot was not a tabloid writer. That was what made it so dangerous. He was considered the intellectual voice of basketball criticism, the kind of writer whose opinions shaped how the sport was understood by serious people. His argument was not that Jordan was a bad player. His argument was worse than that. It was that Jordan was a manufactured phenomenon, a brilliantly marketed product whose reputation had been constructed more by Nike, by NBC, by the sports media machine, and by a carefully controlled public image than by any transcendent quality that actually separated him from other elite players of his era. Talbot wrote that Jordan's team success was primarily the result of Phil Jackson's triangle offense and the surrounding talent of Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, and John Paxson. He argued that Jordan's individual statistics, while extraordinary, masked a fundamental selfishness that had actually delayed the Bulls' championship window by several years. He cited anonymous sources inside the organization who described a locker room culture of fear, intimidation, and psychological cruelty. He quoted former teammates who spoke of being verbally destroyed by Jordan in practice, of being publicly humiliated when they made mistakes, of playing under a kind of authoritarian pressure that was more exhausting than motivating. But the section that cut the deepest was the one about legacy. Talbot argued that the sports media had colluded in constructing a mythology around Jordan that was fundamentally dishonest, that the image of Jordan as a once-in-a-generation competitor who elevated everyone around him was a story the industry needed, not a reality that the evidence supported. And then he wrote the sentence that would define the entire controversy. He wrote that Michael Jordan was not the greatest basketball player of his generation. He was the greatest marketing product of his generation, and history would eventually untangle the two. The article dropped on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it was on every television sports show in the country. By Wednesday, it had crossed into mainstream news. Commentators who had spent years celebrating Jordan were suddenly being asked on live television whether Talbot had a point. Former players were being pulled in front of cameras and asked to respond. The question being asked everywhere, in barbershops, in offices, on radio call-in shows, was simple and brutal. Was Michael Jordan actually who we thought he was? Jordan himself said nothing publicly. That was his way. He had learned early in his career that responding to criticism in the press only extended the story and gave it oxygen. His publicist released a single statement saying that Michael Jordan's record spoke for itself and that he would continue to let his performance answer his critics. It was measured, professional, and completely inadequate for the scale of what was happening. What almost no one knew was what was happening privately. A person close to the Bulls organization at that time described Jordan in those days as genuinely shaken, not broken. Jordan was not a man who broke easily, but shaken in a specific way that was perhaps more uncomfortable than breaking. Because the attack was not simply about basketball, it was about identity. It was about whether the thing he had dedicated his entire existence to was real or constructed. Whether the suffering, the obsession, the years of physical and psychological sacrifice had built something genuine, or had been used to build something that other people profited from while he served as the face of an illusion. The doubt that Talbot had planted was not about whether Jordan could play basketball. It was about whether any of it meant what he believed it meant. And that kind of doubt does not answer to statistics. It lives in a place that trophies cannot reach. Charles Oakley heard about the article the same morning it published. Oakley and Jordan went back to their days together on the Bulls before Oakley was traded to the New York Knicks in 1988. Their relationship was one of the truest friendships in professional basketball, built in practice gyms and on long road trips, and in the particular crucible of competing alongside someone day after day until you know them in ways that public perception never can. Oakley was not a man known for sentiment. He was known for physicality, for toughness, for a kind of blunt, uncompromising presence that made opponents uncomfortable and teammates feel safe. He was the person you wanted next to you when things got hard, not because he would say the right thing, but because he would do something. Oakley read the entire article twice. He did not call Jordan immediately. He spent 2 days thinking. He talked to a few people whose judgment he trusted, and then he decided that the situation required not a conversation, but an action. Because Oakley understood something about Michael Jordan that Talbot's article had completely missed, Jordan did not need to be defended with words. Jordan needed to be given a stage where the truth could be demonstrated in a way that no amount of sophisticated prose could dispute. Oakley made calls. Specifically, he reached out to 3 men whose credibility in basketball was completely beyond question. First, he called Magic Johnson, who had retired 2 years earlier and was universally regarded as the standard of basketball intelligence and team-first mentality. Second, he called Larry Bird, whose relationship with Jordan was built on the particular mutual respect that only exists between competitors who have tested each other at the highest level. Third, he called Isaiah Thomas, which was significant precisely because Thomas and Jordan had a famously complicated relationship, and Oakley knew that Thomas's willingness to speak to the truth would carry weight that friendly voices never could. Oakley did not ask any of them to simply defend Jordan. He asked each of them a specific question. He asked them to describe in concrete terms what it was actually like to compete against Michael Jordan. Not the marketing image, not the highlight reel, the actual experience of standing across from him on a basketball court when everything was on the line. He recorded each conversation with permission, and then he contacted 4 of the most respected sports journalists in the country, not Talbot's allies, but figures whose intellectual credibility was established independently, and he invited them to a private session at a hotel in Chicago. The session had no cameras, no broadcast, no social media, which barely existed in any meaningful form at that time. It was 8 people in a conference room, 4 journalists, Oakley, and 3 recorded voices that Oakley played through a speaker system he had arranged himself. He told the journalists at the outset that he was not there to attack Talbot personally, and he was not there to ask them to print a rebuttal. He was there to give them information they did not have, and what they did with it was entirely their decision. He played Magic Johnson first. Johnson spoke for 11 minutes. He described specific games, specific moments, specific conversations that happened during competition that revealed the nature of Jordan's effect on those around him. He described the 1991 finals, but not from the box score, from inside. He talked about the way Jordan's presence forced every player on both teams to compete at a level they could not sustain independently. He said, and this was the line that the journalists later agreed was the most striking, that playing against Michael Jordan was the only time in his career that he genuinely feared losing control of his own greatness. That Jordan created a gravitational force that pulled your best out of you, whether you wanted it or not. Bird spoke next. His was the shortest recording, barely 6 minutes, because Bird did not use many words when fewer would do, but every sentence landed. He talked about watching Jordan in practice versus watching him in games, and described a quality he called intelligent suffering, the capacity to push through not just physical pain, but the specific psychological pain of not being good enough yet, of being in a process that had no guaranteed outcome, and to stay in that process without flinching. Bird said he had seen that quality in perhaps 4 or 5 players in his lifetime. He said Jordan had it in greater quantity than anyone he had ever competed against. Thomas was last. And his recording was the one that silenced the room completely. Because Thomas began by acknowledging that he and Jordan had not always had an easy relationship. He said that plainly, without drama, and then he said that his complicated feelings about Jordan personally had never once changed his understanding of what Jordan was as a basketball player and competitor. He described the 1988 playoffs in specific detail. He described moments of Jordan's dominance that he had never spoken about publicly because they belonged to the private world of competition where the truth lives without needing an audience. And he said that anyone who argued that Jordan's greatness was a product of marketing rather than of something real and almost incomprehensible had simply never stood across from him when the game was on the line. The journalists in that room were quiet for a long time after Oakley finished. One of them asked why Oakley had not simply released the recordings publicly, held a press conference, made it a media event. Oakley's answer was characteristically direct. He said that a press conference would have made it about the fight, about Talbot and Jordan and controversy and ratings. He said he did not want to give people a spectacle. He wanted to give them the truth in a room where they could sit with it and decide what it meant without an audience telling them how to react. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 of those 4 journalists published pieces about Jordan. None of them were direct rebuttals of Talbot's article. They were something more interesting. They were recalibrations. They each approached the question of Jordan's legacy from a different angle. And each of them, without citing the private session or the recordings, arrived at conclusions that quietly and thoroughly demolished the central premise of what Talbot had written. They did not say Talbot was wrong. They presented evidence and testimony and analysis that made his argument impossible to sustain for any reader who engaged with it seriously. The effect was slower than a press conference would have been. It built over days rather than exploding overnight, but it was permanent in a way that spectacle almost never is, because it changed not just what people thought about the specific controversy, but how they thought about the larger question. The conversation in basketball circles shifted from whether Jordan was a marketing product to a much more interesting question, which was why the industry needed to frame transcendent competitors in marketing terms at all, as if the commercial success somehow contaminated the athletic reality, rather than reflecting it. Jordan found out what Oakley had done about 3 weeks after the session. Oakley had not told him in advance because he knew Jordan well enough to know that Jordan would have told him not to do it. Jordan called him the evening he found out. The conversation, by all accounts, was not long. Jordan was not a man who expressed himself easily in emotional terms, and Oakley was not a man who required it. What Jordan said, according to people who later heard him describe the call, was simply that he wanted Oakley to understand something. He said that there were many people in his life who had benefited from his success and called themselves his supporters, and there were very few people who had ever done something for him that they did not expect him to see, that cost them their own time and energy, that they did it purely because they believed it was right. He told Oakley he was one of perhaps 3 people he had ever known who fell into that second category. What made Oakley's response to the crisis extraordinary was not the outcome. It was the thinking behind it. He had understood something that most people in Jordan's circle failed to understand, which was that the attack on Jordan was not really about basketball. It was about legitimacy. It was about whether greatness that exists in the real world can survive contact with sophisticated skepticism. And the answer to that kind of attack is never an equal and opposite argument. The answer is evidence presented in a context where it cannot be dismissed as self-interested or motivated by loyalty. Oakley had given credible, complicated, sometimes even reluctant witnesses the opportunity to speak the truth in a setting where the truth was the only thing that mattered. Talbot never formally retracted his article, but in an interview 18 months later, when Jordan had won his 3rd consecutive championship and the dynasty was complete, Talbot was asked about the piece. He said that he stood by the structural critique of how sports media constructs athletic mythology, but he acknowledged, with what appeared to be genuine discomfort, that he had allowed that structural critique to bleed into a personal judgment about Jordan's competitive reality, and that the personal judgment had been formed from sources and a perspective that was more limited than he had understood at the time. It was not a full apology, but from someone of Talbot's intellectual pride, it was as close as such things come. Jordan went on to win 3 more championships after returning from his first retirement. He became not simply the most decorated player of his generation, but the standard by which all future competitors in any sport would be measured. The marketing did not create that. The marketing followed it, as marketing always follows genuine phenomena, attaching itself to things that are already real and remarkable, and trying to translate them into something that can be sold. The reality existed first. The reality always existed first. Oakley never spoke publicly about what he had done. When journalists asked him in later years about his friendship with Jordan, he described it in simple terms. He said that he had grown up learning that loyalty was not about what you said when someone asked you to defend a friend. Loyalty was about what you did when no one was asking. When you saw something that needed to be corrected, and you had the capacity to help correct it, and you did it without needing credit or acknowledgement. He said that was the only version of loyalty that meant anything to him. The version that costs you something. The version that nobody sees. The lesson of what happened that spring is not really about Michael Jordan. Jordan's greatness was always going to be established by time and by the record of what he accomplished. The lesson is about what it means to defend something true when sophisticated arguments are being used to make it seem uncertain, and it is about the rarest kind of friendship, the kind that does not wait to be asked, that does not calculate the personal cost, that simply sees what needs to be done and does it with intelligence and without fanfare. Charles Oakley looked at a situation where the most famous athlete in the world was being publicly diminished and decided that the right response was not noise. It was clarity, delivered quietly to the right people, in a room where the only thing present was the truth.